Today we're revisiting the potential Jack Eichel trade we could see this offseason. Will the Los Angeles Kings be his biggest suitor? And should the Ottawa Senators try to reunite the brothers Tkachuk and trade for Matthew out of Calgary? We'll discuss that coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. Now, as I mentioned today, we're looking at some NHL trade rumors. The Eichel situation is more of a rumored situation that could be happening, whereas the Matthew Tkachuk situation comes from an article from the Ottawa Sun, basically just looking at the possibility of something should the Sens pursue it or not. So let's start here with the Jack Eichel talk. Now, of course, we touched on this a few days ago. We just didn't go in as much detail on the Los Angeles Kings. So today I want to talk a little bit further about what we had discussed 3 or 4 days ago with Jack Eichel likely being on the move this offseason. Of course, there's no guarantee that he gets traded. A lot of it is going to be determined on the return package, and a little bit to a degree will be determined by what he wants to do. Now, I believe in the not too distant future, he does have a no trade clause kicking in, so the Sabres will have more options and flexibility to do this now, this offseason, than they will in another year's time. So obviously, it's probably the best time to do it if you feel like it's best for the organization to kind of cut bait here, get a good return, move on. And of course, for him, he can start having hopefully a little bit more success and get into some playoff action, etc., and kind of progress through his career here. Because many people feel that Jack Eichel, if he gets on a better team and can be surrounded by better players, is really one of the league's top players and could go on to have an absolutely great career and be a really solid all-time player. Now, of course, the Los Angeles Kings are a team that we want to discuss. Now, of course, in a recent radio interview, Darren Dreger is the one who was talking about this, TSN insider, talking about the fact that he said he would be very surprised if Eichel wasn't traded this offseason. He feels the odds are really high of it happening. So that's kind of where we went with in the last video where we talked about it, and I named some teams that I felt were likely suitors, and a couple of them that had been rumored, being the Kings one of them, as well as the Rangers, and a few others that I thought would make good sense. And we talked about what kind of packages could be put together to entice the Sabres to make that trade take place. Now, of course, we already kind of know what the package would need to be based on previous reports from Darren Dreger and other TSN insiders indicating that the Sabres are going to want about 4 assets in return for Eichel that are all first-round quality assets. Now, it doesn't mean they have to be first-round picks, and it doesn't mean that they have to be players that were first-round picks. It just means that they're quality picks that would be equivalent to a first-round pick. So, for example, if a team like LA wanted to pick up Jack Eichel from the Sabres, they might throw in 1 or 2 actual first-round draft picks and maybe 2 or maybe even 3, players and prospects that kind of fall into being either recent first-round picks or players that maybe have been elevated to that status. So maybe somebody was a second-round pick, but they've been in the league for a couple of years. They're still only 21, 22 years old. And really looking back on it, they're the equivalent of a good first-rounder. That would be potentially be included as well. Doesn't mean they have to have been first rounder, because you know what? Not all first round picks work out. Some work out great, some don't. Some later round picks end up being just as good or better. So essentially, they're looking for 4 really solid assets, and the Kings are one of the best teams positioned to make this happen. As I mentioned before, I felt the Kings and the Rangers had the best opportunity, but you know what? There's probably an argument to be made, and I believe I said this as well the other day, that the Kings to me are the absolutely best position. They have arguably the deepest prospect pool. The Rangers are pretty darn good themselves, but a lot of their players that I would consider being into this are not really prospects anymore. A lot of them are getting into the lineup now and becoming regular players. So if you take a look at the Los Angeles Kings and the deep amount of players they could pick from, I mean, obviously you're looking at a really solid group of young center prospects as well. Since Eichel's a center, the Sabres are going to want at least one really solid center prospect coming back, either a prospect or a really young player that's been in the league just a short period of time. You're looking at guys like a Gabe Vilardi, like an Alex Turcotte, like a Rasmus Kupari. They have several other great prospects as well, including Anderson Dolan. You get some defenders like Bjornfoot and Clegg. I mean, and the list goes on in Los Angeles. You get Arthur Kaliev as well, who's a really solid goal-scoring winger. They have a really deep group there in Los Angeles that they could really put together a solid package. So let's say they put in maybe an Alex Turcotte. Now, Turcotte might not be a guy they really want to trade, but to get in a guy like Eichel, you're going to have to give up something substantial. So either a Turcotte or a Kupari would have to be in there for sure. Their first-round centerman. Then, of course, you're going to throw in at least one first-round pick. Maybe you throw in one of those defensive prospects. So either Clegg or Bjornfoot would have to be in there as well. And then maybe you're looking at either something off the roster or maybe a second first-round pick or something like that. Probably a younger, more established player, because they're going to not all want everything for the future. They're going to want something that can jump in right away. Now, Alex Turcotte's at a point. He can play right away. The defensive prospect can as well. Obviously the first-round pick's hard to say on who they pick. And then like that fourth piece, maybe, a younger player off the roster. It could be Anderson Dolan. It could be, anybody else really off the Kings roster that wouldn't be an older player. Realistically, the Los Angeles Kings could really put together a solid package. And according to Darren Dreger, he originally started saying that he believed a Western team had been inquiring and kind of having conversations, and then he later named that team to be the Los Angeles Kings, indicating that they seem to be right at the top of the list for parties that are interested. But of course, if it becomes public knowledge that across the NHL that Eichel is available for trade and they're looking to make a trade, that pretty much every team around the NHL is going to inquire. But as we talked about in the video regarding Jack Eichel a few days ago, like I said, a team like Minnesota makes a lot of sense. A team like Boston makes a lot of sense. I'm just not convinced they're going to have anywhere near the assets that Sabres are going to want to really make it enticing enough to really consider making that deal. The Rangers can, but they're going to have to include, obviously, some big pieces that they may not want to, but the Kings are the same boat. I mean, like I said, either Kakko or Lafreniere would have to be included. You're looking at a first-round pick. You're looking at a solid young defenseman or defensive prospect. So maybe it's K'Andre Miller. Maybe it's Zach Jones. Obviously they're not going to want to move Adam Fox. He's probably one of the few that would be off limits after how well he's played this year. But one of their solid young blue liners, maybe it's Nils Lundqvist who's on the way as well. Like one of those three guys are in there. You're likely, like I said, either Kakko or Lafreniere. You got a first-round pick, and then you're looking at probably a fourth asset. Maybe it's a younger player off the team. It could even be a player like, I don't know, maybe it's even Ryan Strome. I mean, Ryan Strome's not an old player, but he's not a super young player as well, as in his mid-20s. Getting to the latter part of the 20s, but still he's had some good years. Obviously, getting Eichel in there kind of reduces the need for him down the middle as well. Or maybe you have to include another centerman. I would assume after the way Zibanejad's played this year, I mean, he started slow, but they probably wouldn't want to include Zibanejad. If they have Zibanejad, Eichel down the middle, I mean, that's pretty darn lethal here. So clearly a guy like Strome could drop to number 3. I mean, it's obviously going to involve salary cap issues as well, because Eichel makes a lot of money and there's obviously going to be cap gymnastics. So there's other things involved here that are going to be more than just what the Sabres want. They may have to take back a certain amount of money on top of the good prospects and assets that they are going to want to make this happen. But like I said, the Rangers could put together a heck of a package too. But considering where they're at and how a lot of these younger players on the Rangers side of things, they're already kind of, I think, getting bigger roles slowly here. So I don't know. The LA makes a ton of sense. And if they're going to push and push and push, I mean, on top of all the guys I mentioned, I didn't even mention Quinton Byfield, the number 2 overall pick from the 2020 NHL draft, like another top center. Like really, like you take your pick. Like Velarde is probably the one who's the oldest, probably the most risk involved because of his injury past. So I'm going to assume maybe the Sabres prefer not to have Velarde. They might take him as an add-on, as that maybe that fourth piece. But they're going to need a guy like either Byfield or Turcotte or Kupari. Like one of all those guys are not going to be Los Angeles Kings. You know that. So it makes sense that the Sabres might try to dangle one or two of them in order to accelerate the rebuild and to get to be more competitive quicker, so they can start having a chance to win much quicker. I mean, a guy like Eichel really accelerates that rebuild. So, I mean, look at what the Kings can put together for a package. If they're going to push for Eichel, they can really knock the socks off here for Buffalo. And obviously, another thing, too, that I think could weigh in here. It's not just all the losing and the culture and the frustration of Eichel. It seems to me, based on the issue he's been dealing with this year and injury-wise with the herniated disc in his neck, it seems like there could be, maybe it's just me, but my take on that kind of seems like there could be a difference of opinion between himself and Sabres medical staff as well. I mean, Dreger did mention that It looks as though he was, hoping to have surgery sometime maybe in May, and he kind of found it a little odd that the Sabres hadn't talked about his injury status more and updated things more, and this kind of made it sound like maybe there could be, a difference of opinion there on the medical stuff. And now that can drive a wedge between the relationship as well if the player doesn't feel like their medical staff is really looking out in their best interest or they're not confident in what they're doing there. But I mean, that's just, a small fraction of it here. A lot of it has to do with the culture and the lack of winning. But let me know what your thoughts are on Eichel to the Kings. Does it make a lot of sense? Do you think the Kings should push for this deal? And let me know what pieces you feel would be most likely included or what they should be offering here to get this deal done. Especially if you're a Kings fan, do you want them to go down this road? Let me know your thoughts on that. And now next up, like I said, there was an article in the Ottawa Sun talking about the possibility here that the Calgary Flames going through a bit of a reset or a rebuild, maybe not a rebuild, but definitely some changes coming this offseason. Assuming that things don't change in a real hurry here for the Flames, they're more likely not making the playoffs this year. We know that there's a really good chance based on recent videos that we've talked about and obviously what we've heard in the news that guys like Monahan and Gaudreau are certainly possibly on notice for their amount of time here in Calgary, and that is a real good possibility. One or two of them, or maybe both, hard to say, but something is going to happen for you via trade, and they're right at the top of the most likely tradable list to shake things up. I mean, Sean Monahan has been he's been declining in my opinion for 2 years. He's really declined hard under coach Daryl Sutter. And if Sutter's going to be around for a couple more years coaching this team, I just don't see how he kind of fits that style. And it makes a lot of sense that he could be moved. And like I said, there's a lot of uncertainty around Johnny Gaudreau's future. But those are the two main guys when you talk about Flames trades to really shake up the core that everybody talks about. But this article goes on to suggest that maybe they should consider moving a guy like Matthew Tkachuk as well. I voiced my concerns to saying that the last, really most of the season, really after probably the first few weeks, it didn't seem like he's been the same player, and I'm not sure what's going on there, but he just doesn't seem to be that hard to play against, pesty kind of player that kind of drives everybody crazy. And I just wonder if maybe he was asked to kind of change how he plays, and I just don't think there was anything wrong with how he played. He was turning into a fantastic hockey player, and he's still really good, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying Matthew Tkachuk sucks all of a sudden because he doesn't, but he's just, to me, he hasn't been as effective, and his numbers are down. I've seen him play a lot this year, and there's been too many nights where you don't notice him the way you used to, and that's just my own personal eye test take on where things are at in Calgary. And then I saw this article saying, well, maybe Ottawa should push to bring him to play with his brother Brady. And that's a very interesting concept, especially as somebody who cheers for the Senators. It's quite a thought. But at the same time, like any big-time player, what's it going to cost? Should they do it? I don't know. So let's examine things a little bit closer. If you look at the Ottawa Senators and this young group of players that are slowly becoming the core of the team, if you look at that forward group, the top six group right now, obviously your top two centers likely moving forward are going to be Josh Norris, likely Shane Pinto into next year. He's been impressive in his brief amount of time so far, but he's projecting to be a top six center right now. So you've got your two center icemen right there. On the wings, you've got Brady Tkachuk, you've got Drake Batherson, and you got Timmy Stützle. Those are 5 of your top six players. So you're still kind of got a missing role there. Now, a guy like Evgeny Dodonov was expected to be that guy, but he hasn't really been able to hold that down on a consistent basis. And even though he's been a streaky scorer, and if you look at his stats, they're not too terrible, but still, you can make an argument that signing hasn't really worked out. But it's a big adjustment. He went from playing with guys like Barkov and Huberdeau to getting way different assignments, way different line mates. There's going to be an adjustment period. Not to say that contract couldn't work out, and maybe it will. Hard to say, but right now, he's not considered and relied upon on a nightly basis of being a consistent top six forward. He quite often will get like a third line type of duty. I mean, obviously they got guys like Nick Paul and Connor Brown, hardworking kind of players. Connor Brown scoring at a really high rate after that 8-game streak he was on, but still, again, ideally third line players. So they're really, to me, in my opinion, on the Senators team moving forward, there is a hole for one more good big time player in the top six to really round things out nicely. And Matthew Tkachuk would be the ultimate perfect player. So should they consider it? Of course they should consider it. Now, can they do it? It's hard to say. Will the Flames even consider trading Matthew? Very difficult to say. I would say that the odds are slim at best. But really, when you have a team that is in a situation like them where they're, after a back-to-back seasons of disappointing results, and if they miss the playoffs, You know they're going to be looking for change, and even though Matthew Tkachuk likely isn't near the top of their list for players they want to consider trading, if you make them an intriguing offer enough, you're going to have to make it so that they have to listen, and they have to consider getting the deal done, and you just never know. If it makes them a better team, maybe. I mean, there's no harm in having that conversation and trying. So if you look at what Ottawa can bring, a lot of the other top 6 guys that I just mentioned would be pretty well considered untouchables. Ideally, they wouldn't want to trade Thomas Chabot, but what could they look at doing beyond that? Well, obviously, they have 6'6" center iceman Logan Brown, former first-round pick. He's not in a consistent spot yet in the lineup. I'm sure he would be on the table. Well, how Calgary would feel about Logan Brown, I don't know, but I know in a heartbeat, if the Senators are talking about a trade for something that magnitude, he would definitely be included, at least on their part. I think a guy like Colin White would be shopped for sure. He's not living up to his contract, and as much as he is liked with the organization, he fits in quite nicely with a lot of his other U.S. pals that he's been played a lot with growing up. Ultimately, I think he could be moved. I mean, he could be a guy who could be in the right situation, still be a top 6 center iceman if you put him in the right spot with the right line mates. But at the end of the day, his contract's not too bad, but he's not living up to it right now in Ottawa. Could use a change of scenery. Obviously, you have some other prospects like in the minors right now, guys like Angus Crookshank and Sokolov. They're playing extremely well, scoring at a high rate. They could certainly throw in. I would be willing to include at least one first-round pick, maybe more. Hard to say. If you look at the back end, maybe a guy like Eric Brandstrom becomes expendable. He's still projects to be a top 4 defenseman, but obviously the Senators have a lot of defensive help coming, like Jake Sanderson. I would assume Sanderson wouldn't be made available, but again, you just never really know here. But I mean, they have the assets. You could throw in, like I said, 1 or 2 first-round picks and a couple of those young prospects, and especially if you say a really solid forward prospect and a really solid defensive prospect, I think the Flames at least have to listen. Now, they would probably push to have some other assets included that Ottawa preferably would not want to give up. And they can even consider one of their young goalies because they have more than enough at this point. They've got Philip Gustafsson, Joey Decord, then they've got Kevin Mandleys in the minors too, and then they just signed Mads Sogard. He's a Danish goalie who's a really good goalie too. Now the Flames have Markstrom under contract for a long time, so they don't necessarily need a starting goalie right away, but they could certainly use a potential backup. They just traded David Riddick, so maybe one of those young goalies could come in as a backup goalie. So maybe they're interested in one of them. So there's a lot of different pieces there that could be intriguing. The Senators, like the Kings, like the Rangers, have a pretty deep young group of players. Whether most of them now are at the NHL level, but there's still a lot more coming. There's still Ridley Gregg from the 2020 NHL draft. He's also another good young center prospect too. And there's more. So I think they have plenty of assets to intrigue the Flames. Should they do it? I don't see why not. Now, there's no guarantee it's going to happen, but you imagine both Matthew and Brady Tkachuk playing on the same team, how difficult that would be for the opponents. I mean, if you can get Matthew playing back to, my opinion, back to being the more original Matthew Tkachuk, throw in Brady, that would be an insane thing to do. It really, really would round out Ottawa's top 6 and really push them a little further along, much closer to being more of a playoff contender. Because, I think they're still probably another year away from really challenging for a spot. But adding a guy like Tkachuk in there to play with his brother would be a big step in the right direction. Now, I realize here that the odds of this happening are extremely slim, but I found the article interesting. I think it's something that should be pursued. Whether or not the Flames even want to entertain it, though, is a whole separate idea. Let me know what your thoughts are. If the Ottawa Senators were to pursue Matthew Tkachuk in Calgary, what kind of package do you think it would take to really make the Flames listen to get the deal done? If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and turning on your notifications so you don't miss any future content. And give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. I'd appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.